Hello. Yes, we're live. Wait. Well, I'm live. Caitlin. All right. Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers, as I'm meandering on and off because I'm still getting set up. I'm Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois. Joining me today will be Caitlin Miller, who is a licensed professional counselor. She and I work together at a practice called Effective Artistry. We specialize in working with, through a neurodiversity affirming lens, working with people who identify as neurodivergent, but bringing that neurodiversity approach to all the work that we do, whether people identify that way or not. Caitlin, I see you're in the backstage area. Will you just give me a thumbs up if you're ready for me to add you live? Okay.
Hello.
Caitlin and I are both licensed therapists, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. That's why we
So many.
With that to be as clear as possible about what we're doing here. Typically, we have Maria Moran joining us in hosting. She unfortunately is not available today or next Monday, so we'll see her in a couple of weeks. But today and next week, it'll be Caitlin and I. Our practice, Effective Artistry, we do individual, couples, family therapy with people in the state of Illinois. We also work with a few executive functioning coaches. Maria is one of them, who can work with people all over the world who are looking for just executive functioning support specifically. This is not therapy, it's just an open conversation. Caitlin and I are going to be talking. And for those of you who are here, and thank you for being here, we're going to be talking about things and saying things in ways that are influenced by our perception, our guesses about what might be interesting or useful to you all. If you actually put stuff in the chat, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch, then we'll see that. And that helps us to know a lot more about what might be interesting to you. So whatever we're talking about, our priority is always whoever is here watching. Don't worry about if we're on a topic and you have a thought or a question or whatever about something else. Please put it in there. We'd always much rather be talking about the things that are specifically relevant to you all. Caitlin and I, fortunately, get a lot of time to talk to one another.
Yes, we do.
So this is not our only opportunity. We don't need to use this time to talk about whatever we feel like talking about.
Just to give you a heads up, Brandon, I can't see the chat, so you might have to just
I'm keeping an eye on it.
I will have a better home setup at some point, or maybe I just won't do this from home.
That's all right. We're all good. Yeah. How are you, Caitlin?
I had a much slower Monday morning, which was very nice. I was like, oh, this is maybe a great way to start the week. So, yeah.
Good.
A little spacey. How are you, Brandon?
I'm good. Yeah. I had a good weekend and feeling good. I had a little bit of a cold at the end of last week and I'm 98% over that at this point. You know, my voice almost is purely back to what's on your mind or wanting to talk about, or
I was just gonna say collective unconsciousness.
About that, the Jungian theory of the collective unconscious. We can discuss that if you want.
What?
What are you thinking about it?
Well, I was kind of joking, but the thing I was thinking about is last night I sat down and I was like, I'm gonna write a pop song. I'm gonna challenge myself and it's gonna be a happy pop song. And I wrote it and I was like, this sounds really familiar. And I tried to find a couple songs and I was like, no, it's not this one. It's not this one. And then this morning I was like, oh my God, it's Beyonce's Halo. I was like, that's what it is. And then I listened to it and the main like poppy progression that I did is almost exactly the same. And I'm not trying to claim it's just as good as Beyonce's Halo, but it was really interesting because I was like, wait, this sounds really familiar. So so that's where I was getting to from that because I write a lot of very sad things. So I thought I'm going to teach myself how to write happy or even nostalgic or I don't know, lustful, positive more music. It doesn't even have to be literally happy, but yeah.
Well, I like the collective unconscious and would be happy to discuss some of that. But my first thought is kind of related to some of what we've been talking about being creative and being an artist over the past few weeks. That
Hmm.
like there are only so many options. You know, there are only so many
Oh yeah.
chords. Especially if you're going for a happy vibe, there's a narrow range
Hmm.
of tempos and chord structures and whatever.
Hmm.
And that like specifically, there's some video out there that I saw a long time ago where someone's playing the same four chords and then sings like 40 different famous songs that are all like follow the same chord progression.
Yeah, correct. It was I think what I'm talking about too is the melody and when I write music that's sad that also feels more authentic to me, I don't hear other people's music in it. So I think those contextual clues are worth sharing.
Do you know who Bobby McFerrin is?
I do. I don't know if I can track music though.
The song that most people know from him is "Don't Worry, Be Happy." Like that's the one
Oh yeah. Hmm.
like song of his that got radio play. But he's a really fascinating musician. Like as a vocalist, he's got an incredible range. So a lot of what he's done, I was going to say recently, but honestly, like this is what I was looking at in high school, so probably not that recent. Uh, is like perform with like Yo-Yo Ma or with orchestras, like using his voice as a substitute in taking some like instrumental part. Anyway, I'm saying some of that
Ooh.
because I specifically think you, Caitlin, would find him and his work fascinating, and also people generally. But there's a video of him I saw a long time ago at some, I don't know, panel or TED Talk or something. I think like in Europe, some other country, not the United States.
Hmm.
Uh, and he gets up on stage and without using any words, he jumps and he goes ba ba and gestures at the audience and they start doing it along with him. And then he
Hmm.
jumps one to the right and goes ba 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 and gets them to do it with him. And then he jumps one more spot to the right and the entire audience does the next note in the scale. Ba ba.
Oh, cool.
And then he stops and he says, that to me is fascinating because I've done that, is what he's saying. I've done that all over the world in like all
Hmm.
different places. And there's something about the pentatonic scale, right? Like that's not the next semitone higher, it's the next in that scale. That
Hmm.
if people those two, they will just all go to the next one.
Hmm.
I find obviously very fascinating. It's stuck in my head for 20 years.
Hmm.
Music music does have like fairly narrow constraints, right? Like especially
Hmm.
if you're going for a particular vibe or feeling, because
Hmm.
that what feels that way is informed by your and other people's cultural experiences of what feels happy. You know,
Hmm.
you use a bunch of minor chords, it's not going to feel happy. You use some major seventh chords, it'll feel more happy. You do
Hmm.
slow tempo, not so much, right? And even melody and things like there's only so many notes you can sing over a particular chord, and if that chord is
Oh yeah.
going, set another chord. I just think like this is a, and you didn't say this. I don't know if this is what you're thinking or feeling, but artists will sometimes, I'd say actually frequently, they'll create something and then find some similarity in what they made to something that they either they know about and weren't consciously thinking of, or they'll become aware of something that they didn't previously know about and be like, oh man, that's got this thing in common with something I've made. And then feel like that invalidates their art. Like it's, they have to abandon that project because it's too similar to something someone else has made.
Hmm.
And and so artists will sometimes talk about like there's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. The point is not that you're doing something new. The point is that you're combining old things in a new way that's unique to you.
Yeah, I guess so, but Brandon, what do you think about the phenomenon of the other the more sad stuff that I make? I don't hear other people's music in.
I mean, that could be a lot of things, but it most likely is a lot more about your perception of the music that you're writing, not so much the reality of that it would be more difficult to connect that to other music.
So maybe it's that then the happier thing didn't feel as authentic to me, and it was like, oh, this doesn't feel like me. This must be like a copy of something, and then looking for it. But that technically the
You
other
approach
stuff is some version of a copy, but I just don't associate it as a copy because it feels more authentic.
the other stuff is also a copy. It's that this wasn't a copy either. What you made is what you made. And of course, like what you think of as a happy sounding melody is informed by the melodies you heard that you think of as happy. How
Hmm.
would it do it otherwise? So
Hmm.
that's what you just said about like feeling something in it and having a response of like, oh, I think that sounds like somebody else's thing, as opposed to, ooh, that's really resonating, or like, oh, I really like that. You know, like it has a
Hmm.
lot to do with your confidence level in your ability to write that. Also, probably part of the reason that you don't write happy stuff, poppy stuff more generally is because you, not because, but that implies that you likely also have a thought of poppy, happier stuff as being more conform, you know, like having a narrower range, being shallower, being, which would not be unique to you. That's the common conceptualization of what pop is that it's all very similar, whatever. So
Hmm.
seeing it as being more similar to other pop, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I don't think of Beyonce as pop, and I didn't even think of Halo as a
I don't
happy
actually,
song. What?
I don't know the song, so I can't speak to that part of it.
I think most people might call it like pop or R&B, but yeah, I don't know. I yeah, I'm not sure where to go with this. This is
Is
helpful to me though.
pop has always been an interesting genre to me, like as a designation. I mean,
Hmm.
like I think something that as somebody who was like in bands and whatever, you know, like wrote songs, but a super common thing that people might not think of if you don't have a similar experience is like how much time we spent talking about our favorite albums or our favorite artists or who we're influenced by or whatever. Like there's a lot of attention paid to like who do we match up with, who are we deliberately trying to like be influenced by, who do we only realize after the fact like, oh, it sounds kind of like something something whatever.
Hmm.
Anyway,
I'm
in
getting more and more convinced over time that maybe music, like music that feels like it's I'm wanting to use the word good, but I don't mean good like well balanced because I can listen to something where I'm like, that's a well balanced song. I don't necessarily like it. I feel like it's a lot more about texture than about structure. Um, yeah, because go ahead.
that's the thing is like what are the markers of a genre, like what are the things which identify that a particular piece of music belongs to a particular genre.
Hmm.
Like obviously there's some of that that's about elements of the music itself, the musicality, the instrumentation, the tempo, the like,
Hmm.
etc. But some of it is cultural and different genres. You know, some genres are very much like no, there are. This is like mostly about musical, like stuff that's actually in the music that you can identify it that way. Other genres
Hmm.
are really a lot more about like, and pop falls onto this for me. Like pop literally means popular, and so kind of by definition, like whatever music's popular is pop.
Hmm.
Rock has a tendency to be talked about that way too, where like you can kind of call almost anything rock if you want to, or
Hmm.
not rock if you don't want to. So pop's just always been interesting to me. Like we talk about it like it's a genre, but like there are very diverse things under the category of what would be considered pop. It's also thrown as a modifier. It's one of those that like pop punk, pop rock, pop.
Oh yeah.
We have a comment. I listened to a podcast episode on lawsuits for songs taking too much from other songs, but it's hard to claim they're copying because there's only so many notes in the Western musical scale. And
yeah, the lawsuits are strange. I don't know. My immediate response to the lawsuits is to be afraid.
Well, specifically, there's something kind of funny about. So, when it comes to like intellectual property lawsuits around music, and I don't know a lot about this. Like the majority of what I know about this comes from an episode of a fictional television show, but where I'm pretty sure that they're talking about real things in that show. Anyway, that what happens is if you own you own the rights to some intellectual property, that you can make any kind of claim, no matter how specious, that somebody else's stuff is in some way infringing on your rights, then you can make a claim and like threaten a suit or even initiate a suit or whatever. And then because the legal system is such an expensive and painful thing, so many people will be willing to just settle with you, right? Like, okay, we'll give you $5,000 or whatever. But every time somebody settles with you, that now becomes more precedent that reinforces future claims where you say, this person's infringing on my property. And part of your evidence is look at these 7 other people who've already admitted that songs of this kind or songs that use this phrase are infringing on my property. People can like almost like a legal scam to try and make money to some extent. Because
that sounds so depressing.
It's super hard to prove in a legal like court battle, like definitively, to not only say like how similar does it need to be, but also that you had some knowledge of it, like, and that there was some awareness of what you were doing, whatever, like.
That might be part of what I was talking about too, is that and sorry, my puppy's really hyper now, so you might be able to hear things, but because I don't think of Beyonce as a direct like inspiration, so I think it was just more surprising to me. But yeah, I do think it's like, I don't know, that's very dark and sad.
Well, there's always like what's the difference between being inspired by somebody's work versus the two of you were both inspired by similar bodies of other people's work, and therefore that's why. And I don't know, and I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert of any none that. But yeah, I think like I would imagine that generally when it comes to lawsuits, which in a second we're going to back up and talk about how ridiculous it is that we're even talking about lawsuits, but
I
imagine that generally when it comes to lawsuits that like successfully whatever, it's about like literally sampling something, because under intellectual property laws there's also what's called fair use, which is ways that you're allowed to use other people's intellectual property even in ways that you're monetizing it without it being an infringement. So like homage, parody, like there are different ways you can, otherwise like every YouTuber would be sued all the time because they're using intellectual property of like the game that they're referencing or whatever. Right?
Oh wow, yeah.
So I would imagine that generally like lawsuits that are successful are literally like they are sampling something, like actually using an identifier of somebody else's stuff.
Yeah.
I think it was 99% Invisible's episode on Who Let the Dogs Out. It was a really good episode. I'm intrigued by that name, 99% Invisible. But yes, it's also ridiculous that we're talking about a lawsuit at all. Have you ever made significant sums of money from any of the songs that you've written that somebody would want to come like trying to get their slice of it?
Are you talking to me right now?
Yeah.
I haven't shared anything.
So
So
no,
yeah.
right? Like, so the fear that if you were very wildly successful, that somewhere down the line somebody might come at you and want a piece of that or whatever. Like, we're already talking about a scenario in which your music or your art of whatever kind has generated millions of dollars worth of profit for you.
I don't know though if that's a because I've seen like artists who don't have very much money get I don't know. I feel like the world is I don't know if it's proportional to how successful someone is. It probably makes it more likely, but I don't think it someone
Let me
can totally.
In order for someone to come after you for something like that, they'd have to be aware of the thing that you've made. So, taking money out of it, it still has become widespread enough, shared enough, viewed enough that somebody else that you don't have a
Not
personal relationship with becomes aware of
it
it.
could be the it could technically be the one person I share it with could sue me.
If they did, you can't sue somebody for something that they make money off of. Quite
Hmm.
literally. I mean that, like, again, I guess I shouldn't say this definitively as like a legal thing, but to my understanding, right, like if you play a cover song at an open mic night, like there's nothing you can be sued for there. It's only when you're merchant like selling this thing and making money off of it that people could come and say some of that money belongs to them.
Do you know if people who put on albums covers if they have to like pay for some sort of right?
People who put on like cover a song on their album. I don't know
Yeah, like
actually.
I'm thinking about when I was in high school musicals and they had to pay a certain amount of money to put on each show or whatever to the, I think,
That's
composer.
that's a specific thing that has a lot to do with how like scripts are monetized. You know, like paying for the
Hmm.
rights of the show. Um, I don't know. I honestly don't know about covers because I don't know what if they would fall under fair use or not. I do know like Weird Al would ask artists permissions before parodying their songs, but even though he technically
Hmm.
didn't need to because parody is covered under fair use. I don't know how much of that was like him just being a stand-up guy, and how much of that was like
Hmm.
covering his butt in case. But
Yeah, yeah.
it's a design podcast about things we don't think about every day, like the design of office chairs, but they define design extremely broadly. That's the 99%
Oh,
invisible.
interesting.
It is
Yeah.
interesting because that's a lot of what I think of my work as being is just drawing people's attention to things that they interact with all the time, but don't really notice or think about.
Hmm.
I do think stuff. I might actually look up that podcast.
Yeah, please remember the name and I can try to get you on it.
Fair
I will
use
not remember the name.
make a meaningful change, it's fair use, but I don't know the legal interpretation well. So, like an acoustic version of something might count as fair use. I don't. Either
Hmm.
way, 99% Invisible is one of my all-time favorite podcasts. I'm reading these out because you said you can't see the comments.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. Thank you.
Uh, yeah. Either way, my larger point for you, Caitlin, and for most people who might be watching this is that fear is disproportionate. We'll say at the very least. It's kind of similar to somebody who's like writing a song and then says like, "Oh man, I don't know. I don't want to have to like deal with how my friends will see me differently when I'm famous. So maybe I just won't write this song anymore." You know, like the
Um, I
can't
mean,
have.
my whole premise to bring this to the stream was really just the shock of how similar it seemed, but nothing about the implications or copyright or if people ever heard it or it was really that was the initial thing.
Sure.
Um, it's not actually a concern of mine. It's
Well,
just where the stream went.
there must be. Well, that's great. And there's something that inspired you to like look it up, right? Like even if it's not a fear or a concern, you you spent time trying to solve this puzzle in your head of what does this sound like.
Hmm.
Uh, and then yes, again, connecting it to things that I don't know if they're relevant to you specifically, but the whole
Yeah, I do feel like they could be relevant to people listening to the stream, but I just want to be very clear that I am not worried about getting sued by Beyonce or something. No,
uh, fair enough. I didn't think you were very
not at
concerned,
all.
but I do
No.
think it's a thing that happens to artists all the time where they by like just naturally, intrinsically, we compare things to other things, including we compare the things we create. That's part of what I was saying about how we'll all talk about genres and whatever and influences is like,
So, Brandon, do you think it's a myth in the art world when people talk about, oh, you need to develop your own style if style doesn't necessarily exist in the sense that style is unique? Like, style exists in the sense of, oh, this person has these characteristics of their art, but I don't think style exists in the sense of, like, no one before has sounded like this person.
yeah, well, I guess,
Because I
like,
feel like in the visual arts community, particularly, like visual artists I have known, they're like, you have to have your own style. You can't just, I don't know.
I mean, obviously it depends on what people mean by style. And as we've talked about, like artists are notoriously unspecific in the language that we use talking about our art process with one another.
Hmm.
Like, you know, you got to let your what's inside come out on the canvas, which is like great and evocative and can like impact you in a way that allows you to do something. But in terms of like what exactly does that mean, it's hard to say.
Hmm.
So it depends on that. But I would say that if I were, like another version of that is you have to find your voice, develop your voice or whatever.
Hmm.
There's a there's at least some element of people giving that advice that what it's connected to, what they're trying to get at is like authenticity, not from the lens of you'll do better like in the marketplace if you are more distinct from other people or novel or whatever, but more in the sense of you'll do better at creating your art as you
Well,
look
yeah,
and
I
voice.
think the utility of that advice is some version of authenticity or also what art making brings you the most joy. But I do feel like there's a second aspect of that piece of advice that I don't know if it's useful at all, which is essentially don't share things until you can claim that they're unique, because I don't think that really exists.
Yeah, and I not only do I think like if that's the impression or the fallout of that advice, not only do I think is that not helpful, I think it's actually detrimental to your work
Oh
as an
yeah.
artist. Like we've talked
Hmm.
about, sharing your art is the thing. It's the only thing.
Hmm.
I I actually think this might be one of those pieces of advice that's funny to me, funny in a like tragic way, where I think it may frequently have the opposite impact of what it's intended to have. That I
Hmm.
think it's likely that a lot of the time when people are saying like you got to find your own style, what they're really saying is don't worry about what everybody else is doing. Don't worry about paying so much attention to everybody else's art and just focus on yours. But then it can get interpreted as, oh, so I should be very aware of what everyone else is doing so that I make sure that my stuff is different from them.
Hmm.
Finding your own style doesn't necessarily mean that it's different from other people, right? That I think a lot of the time it just means figure out what you like and what you want to do, but then it can get interpreted to mean figure out how to be different from other people, which involves paying a lot
Hmm.
of attention to other people.
Hmm.
An example of that kind of advice that is tragically hilarious to me is just do your best, where typically when someone is saying don't worry about it, just do your best, what they mean is the quality of the result is not so important. What's important is just that you make some attempt. Don't worry about how good it is or isn't. But because you're saying do your
Hmm.
best, sometimes I think quite frequently people will interpret that and say like, oh, if I do anything less than my best, that's not acceptable. And it's difficult to define best in any way other than pour the maximum available amount of resources into this thing that is possible. So specifically in academics, a lot of teachers will say, like, don't worry about it, just do your best, as a way of saying, like, just turn in whatever you have. It's not that important what
Hmm.
exactly it is. And then students will respond to that by not turning anything in, because whatever they've made, they're like, well, this isn't my best. I could do better. And it,
Yeah, in school, I definitely fell into the second bucket.
super common among people who
What?
identify. It's super common among people who identify as neurodivergent.
Yeah, like you said my best, and even though I don't know if there's really any way that I could judge if that happens or not, it clearly has to just, I don't know. Yeah. There was an irony too about people talking about that in the opera industry because so much of it is adhering to like perfect diction with, like so many of it is adhering to the art form that the idea of being unique in the classical music industry is like very, I don't think it's technically impossible, but I feel like it's ironic. I don't know.
Yeah, well, real quick, a couple more comments.
Oh, okay,
Specific
cool.
to this conversation, there's the episode Art Imitates Art on villages of artists in places like Shenzhen, China. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who make reproductions of famous works for like hotel lobbies and stuff. It was an interesting and nuanced episode. Sorry, someone expressed interest,
Ooh.
so I had to recommend at least one episode. Yeah, no need to apologize. I'm glad to know about
Oh, I love that. That sounds like a great episode.
it. Famously, the movie Exit Through the Gift Shop, the documentary Exit Through the Gift Shop, is also an exploration of things like that. Like, what does it mean to be an artist and make art? Like what element of that, whatever.
Hmm.
The idea of doing your best. I need, like, do the best you can within these very specific parameters. Otherwise, the implication is do your best given all the time, energy, and resources possible. Well, yes, and within these specific parameters doesn't actually change that. It just puts parameters around what time and energy and resources are possible. It still says spend the maximum you can within these parameters. Telling someone to do their best is usually an attempt to help them de-stress about what they're doing, and usually has the effect of making them stress way more. Because
Hmm.
a phrase I'll use when talking about this a lot is completion criteria. People need completion criteria. When you're doing something for yourself, that's a different thing. But when someone has asked you or required you or whatever to do something for them that they are
Hmm.
going to be judging whether it's, meets what they asked for or whatever, you don't have an inherent understanding of the criteria that defines like when it is done to the, like how to know when you've created what they've asked you to create. And you need
Hmm.
that from them. And there's different ways of going about that. One of it is to just, submit it and get feedback and submit it and get feedback until you get it where they're wanting it to go. But
Yeah.
especially academics, but things like that, where there's like a one shot at turning it in and it will get evaluated in some meaningful way.
Hmm.
There tends to be a lot of paralysis around like, I don't know when this paper is good enough, right? Like,
Oh,
as,
yeah.
especially for people who are somewhat successful in like the academic realm earlier in life, uh, because they've been trained to not pay attention to the actually identified criteria, right? Like an assignment to write a paper will say use 6 sources and address this and whatever it says what it
Hmm.
wants. But if you're used to writing papers that people are like, wow, this is great, whatever, then you don't tend to look at that criteria and say, as long as I've checked those off, it's done. You're trying to write a good
Yeah.
paper, and that does not
Yeah.
have completion criteria. So the completion criteria then becomes the due date. If you start 3 weeks early, you're still going to be working on it until the last minute. And so a natural way of going about that is to just start working at the last minute,
Hmm.
which is actually, I don't want to get us off track, but it's actually far more beneficial than other approaches, or at least than people think or whatever.
Hmm.
I think I've heard of that, but I haven't seen it. I'll write it down. Oh, that movie. Put it in your best. They don't tell you about is knowing when to give up and turn it in. Well, yes, and even the phrasing there, give up, right? Like as though you haven't accomplished it. But That's the problem. It's a lack of understanding on the person who's giving, the part of the person giving the advice, about how much weight their opinion carries, right? Like,
Hmm.
especially in academics, they think that they're evaluating something objective against objective criteria. And so they're kind of like attempting to kind of connect with you, right? Like join up with you to say,
Yeah.
like, I know this is what's being asked of you, and like, whatever, just do your best, like, don't worry about all that. And miss
Hmm.
that actually what's happening is they're the person, to the person who's doing it, they're the person who is assigning it. So you can't join with the person and say, like, don't worry about what they're asking you when it's you that's the one that's asking them.
Hmm. Yeah.
Give up on making it as good as you can. Yeah, well, I get that. And that's my point, right? Is this plays into conversations about capability and potential and whatever. Like, we're comparing against some theoretical, hypothetical thing. You will never, ever, ever be able to create anything, and this is especially important for artists. You will never be able to create anything that you look at and say there is no possible hypothetical version of this that could be any better, because how would you know
Hmm.
that? What evidence
Yeah.
would lies to say nope, this is as good as it could possibly be?
I feel like a lot of this comes back to the idea of finality, in the sense of whenever I submit this, whenever I'm done with this, whenever I publish this, whenever I share this, this is the final version, so therefore it must be as potentiated as possible.
What a word, potentially. uh
It's a real word, right?
I'm not sure.
Oh, interesting.
Don't know. I gather from context what you mean is this has been worked on to the point that it now is reaching its maximum potential.
Yeah, and I'm just to be clear, I don't agree with anything I'm saying. I'm talking about the myth that I've
Right.
gotten stuck in, and also clients have too. They've said like, well, I'm like I had a client I previously worked with who would say something like, I am figuring out my new art style and it's not quite ready yet because it's not quite as good as my old art style, but I want it to be a new art style. And so I just did this piece that everyone's telling me is brilliant, but I'm not going to share it yet because it's not quite my new art style, as though there couldn't then be, oh, I did this piece 3 months later, here's this piece a little different. Or, the finality, I don't know.
I think this is an example of things that kind of get conflated, right? Where like no one would debate that, like, if a golfer was trying to learn and implement a new swing, that when they start first working on that and then they're in a competition, they're still going to use their old swing because they haven't learned the new one and internalized it well enough, whatever, like,
Hmm.
it's just true kind of generally as like a skill development, in terms of execution, that even when you
Yeah,
have
and this is in a context when the person was at the point where in a game they would be using the new swing, but the new swing just wasn't quite perfect enough yet.
well, the thing is that art doesn't fall under this category, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
it's, I think of a mistake, what I would consider a mistake that's so common that I think it's pretty much just an accepted thing, is the idea that the result, the outcome, the art, is a result of the artist's something about them, their skill, their ability, their potential, whatever, whatever, when it's actually
Hmm.
the reverse. Any comment you're making about a person's skill is something you're only making based on the thing that they produced, right?
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
so thinking of it as like, when people think of their art as an extension of themselves, then of course, yes, it becomes terrifying to share anything when that's
Hmm.
not what it is. And so it's totally understandable to think of it as, I am not as confident in using this new technique, or, making art in this new genre I'm exploring or whatever, as I am confident in doing it the other way.
Hmm.
But the artist's confidence has pretty much nothing to do with the art's reception. Like,
Correct. Yeah.
nobody has any idea what you think of the art. except that if you put it out there, they assume that you're comfortable putting it out there, right? That there's some measure of confidence in the fact of putting it out there. Again, I try to point people to, because this is to me a super common example, that bands and popular artists will make and release an album that people love, and then they'll release another album a couple years later that people think is worse than the first one, and the artists will say, yes, our sound has evolved, like we think this is much better than the first. Of course they do. They wouldn't put out the second one if they didn't think it was even better than the first one. That has nothing to do with whether the people who like the first one are going to like the second one as much or more or less. So your own evaluation of your art is valuable, but not in terms of whether people will like it or how people will respond to it, just in terms of your process of creating it and sharing it. I struggle a lot with wanting to make the best possible experience for players I'm DMing for right from the beginning. The fact that I'm a newer DM shouldn't apply. I should be great at this already. So again, DM is in Dungeons and Dragons.
No, I know. I have a, DMs get attracted to working with me.
Interesting.
It's very funny.
It's not, because this is a common thing people will do, right? Is think like, oh, I should factor in the fact that I'm new into my evaluation, or other people should factor in the fact that I'm new into their evaluation of how good it is or is not or whatever.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with anything. And sometimes you could say, well, that's not fair. Their expectations are too high. Sure. But the flip side is just as true, if not more so, of like, they like what they like. They don't care whether you've been doing it for a month or 100 years.
Yeah.
And so if you want, and I'm sure that you're doing this, right? Like, but if you really focused on making it the best possible experience for the players, then everything about that is about communicating with the players about what they like and don't like, and incorporating things and excluding things to the extent that you're able. The process of doing that is when we get back into like, yes, your thoughts about yourself and your process and what you do. But in terms of what you're aiming for, it doesn't matter whether you're new or not. It matters what the audience is looking for. And I think that's important, because sometimes a player would say like, oh, I want a super combat heavy game, and that's not what you're trying to play. Like, you can't approach it from the idea that your job is to satisfy every potential audience member. That's not possible. It's not fair to ask of you. It's just not how it works.
I also can imagine that if they DM'd a game that a lot of people really enjoyed, and let's say it's the third game it's like in the beginning of it, that they might think, oh, well, I can't quite enjoy how much the players enjoyed it because I'm still just starting at this, and this is the beginning of my experience as a DM, so therefore I still have to like learn more and almost take them away from the joy of it. I don't know. That was something that came up for me.
I worry I try to communicate too much. They might be a little tired of me asking them to tell me what they want. As a general piece of advice, I would tell someone, don't ever hold yourself back from asking something that you want to ask because you're worried the other person might not like you asking. And I know that there are specific instances where that's probably not great advice or whatever, but generally, trust and rely on other people to express to you if they feel like you're asking too much. And it's not that that's never, obviously, I know there are cases where people are annoyed by how much you're asking, but haven't told you or aren't going to tell you. I know that. The point isn't that this way no one will ever be annoyed. The point is, if you're worried about whether someone might be annoyed and you let that stop you from doing it, then you're going to have to worry about everything all the time. Like, if you're trying to anticipate that someone could potentially respond to this by being annoyed, someone could potentially be annoyed by pretty much anything. And a lot of the like questions and stuff we get at the stream or just, presentations or whatever, generally is people looking for rules to avoid ever annoying someone or making someone dislike them or doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And those just don't exist, right? So you got to trust people to communicate with you. And if they don't, like, all you can do is say, like, hey, I'm worried you might be annoyed. I'm worried that you might not be communicating with me. And then you could worry, oh no, what if saying that annoys them, right? Like but you do your best. And if someone doesn't like what you're doing or is annoyed by you asking questions and doesn't want to communicate about it, then yeah, that relationship might fall by the wayside. They might not interact with you anymore. And the alternative is sitting around worrying all the time, like better for both you and them. Like I always say about the point of a first date is not to earn a second date. The point of a first date is to find out whether or not each of you is interested in a second date. If the way you operate bothers them and they are not communicating for whatever reason with you about it and therefore just stop hanging out with you, okay, good. Like they're a person who gets bothered by the way you're operating and isn't comfortable communicating with it. So
I've had people who identify as neurodivergent respond to me saying things like that to them as, well, then how will I find new people who aren't annoyed with me and I am compatible with? Like, I feel like there's I don't know. What would you say, Brendan?
I would say I understand that fear, but they're making it worse by that pattern of behavior. Meaning, to use that same metaphor of a first date, right? If you're so worried that no one will ever want a second date with you that you then just try to earn the second date and never evaluate whether you want one or not, then theoretically, let's say you do it well, right? Like if it's something you're attempting to do all the time, you probably get pretty good at figuring out what people want from you and giving it to them. And so that question is a little bit like saying, well, if I don't put myself in a situation to be in a 2-year-long relationship with someone that isn't a good fit for me, how am I ever going to find someone that's a good fit for me?
Mm-hmm.
And the point is, you're not finding people because you are continuing to make these relationships that don't work for you persist. There's no room to meet new people that do like you the way that you are, because you're spending all of your time and energy with people who maybe do or maybe don't, but you're worried they wouldn't like you the way that you.
I can imagine that person then saying, Brandon, you're making it sound way easier than it really is. It's so hard for me to meet someone.
I can understand that. And I would say, I'm not making it sound easy or difficult at all. I'm literally just describing the process by which it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Meeting new people, and particularly meeting people that you fit in well with, and like, it's not an easy thing. Anybody who is telling you there's a way to do that easily is just lying. Like nobody has 1,000 different relationships that are all wonderful fits. We all find, varying numbers of people, and each of those relationships has a varying degree to which we are close with that person or feel intimate or like we fit well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying what is implied by those things that you're saying is that a person is looking for, how do I make sure I never get rejected? And how do I make sure I never get rejected is a very different question than how do I find people that are a good fit for me? And in fact, all of the strategies that you would pursue in order to avoid ever being rejected are the strategies that mean that you'll never, or that you're very, the more you try to avoid rejection, the less you are going to meet people who you fit well with, partly because you won't make mistakes. So again, someone is saying something like, you're making it sound easy, but it's hard to meet new people. Well, it's hard to meet new people for that person for emotional and energetic reasons. Generally, right? Like it's not typically true in our modern day that you have literally no physical access to being around other human beings. And even if you physically are on it, like there's the internet, you can be.
Yeah.
And again, there's exceptions, but generally what people mean is it's very difficult for me. It's scary for me, anxiety inducing, draining for me to go try to talk to somebody new, meet somebody new, which I absolutely understand for sure. And a massive part of why that is so anxiety inducing or draining or emotionally difficult is because of the fear of, what if they don't like me?
Yeah.
everything that aims at getting people to like you is taking you further away from finding people that you like.
Mm-hmm.
It is a throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks kind of a thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, or to put it in terms that are more common among neurodivergent people, uh, people will sometimes joke about, or honestly, I think mostly fairly seriously talk about like neurodivergent radar, that you identify other neurodivergent people and form a bond and a connection with them and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
An example of that people use that I have used in the past is like, yeah, I had whatever X number of friends and acquaintances and people I hung out with in high school, and 20 years later on, there's one of them I still talk to. And I had however many people I hung out with in college, and 20 years on, there's one of them I still talk to, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that is kind of a winnowing process. Like some of those relationships stay strong, and the relationships that stay strong and persist are the ones that are like the easiest for you to communicate with people, even after long absences and so on and so forth. So as opposed to some like I in advance identified the other neurodivergent person and we became very close, it's more of like the person that I am closest with and have remained closest with, I can now retroactively identify as being neurodivergent because we have a lot in common, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a numbers game. You really want to increase your odds of finding the person that's the best fit? The only strategy that makes sense is meeting as many people as possible. Meeting one person and saying, I have to make this work, is the opposite of trying to find someone who's the best fit. Does that sound like, I mean, you were kind of role-playing responses that someone would have. Do you have another one?
Oh, I wasn't sure if there was like another comment. It's hard for me to track what's happening
There's a
because
couple. I do a thing at the end of the game called Stars and Wishes, where I ask each player to tell me one thing they really liked or a favorite part of the game and one thing they didn't like, they're hoping for, etc. Like, oh, that sorcerer we ran into was really interesting. I hope we get to meet them again. Counts as a wish, as well as I felt that combat went really slowly. I'd like to move faster and at least be given something, or at least be given something to do. That sounds like a great thing to do. I don't know if you're putting that out there as like a piece of advice for people, but yeah, that sounds great. Or if you're saying like maybe this is an example of you trying to communicate too much, and again, sounds great to me. If somebody didn't like it, they'd have to communicate that to you. There's no reason to assume that somebody wouldn't like that, because I can definitively say at least one person, me, would like it. So you can't assume that they don't, right? Really, like when people are talking about people pleasing or masking, all these concepts, especially as it relates to neurodivergent people, at its root, a lot of what we're talking about is identifying what people want and giving it to them, which is not a bad thing to do. It's not an unusual or pathological thing to do. Sorry, something I'm doing to try to grow as a DM instead of trying to be perfect from the get-go. Yeah, that's great. Same with the art stuff we're talking about, whatever. It's iteration. You make an attempt, you get feedback or information about that, you make another attempt. And I'll say too that there are ways of getting information from people that don't necessarily involve being explicit in asking them that thing, right? Like you can do something and oftentimes based on a person's nonverbal reaction to that thing, you'll get a sense of whether they like it or don't like it, right? Like
mm-hmm.
if there's a segment of your game session where everybody's laughing and have, like you can confidently think, okay, they enjoyed that. And if there's a segment of your game session where people are scowling and quiet and angry at you or each other, like they probably didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Caitlin, did you have another thought, or are you just concerned about the time?
I have a lot of thoughts, but we're almost at 2, and the next time I do this from home, I'm going to try to set up a way to track the comments as well, because I think it's hard for me to track when I'd like to interject and add things. So, yeah.
Well, I'll wrap up this last bit of it, and then we can end the stream in just saying that, like, prioritizing doing something that somebody else likes is not a bad or a pathological thing. It's also not always the priority, right? That I think sometimes, especially neurodivergent people, get this idea that you should that masking is bad and you shouldn't do it, which is not the case. Depending on how you define masking, and mostly neurodivergent people define it as pretending to be normal. But like interacting with people in ways that you think are likely to make them happy or get the response from them that you would want to get from them, that's the higher the stakes and the less confident you are, the less safe you feel in predicting that the other person will not respond negatively, the more unmasking will be beneficial. The problem with masking is not that it's like a bad thing to do, it's that it's a costly thing to do. It's the equivalent of being careful, right? Like being careful in a social way. And you can't be careful about everything you do all the time. Being careful means dedicating more resources to the thing than you would typically do because it's worth paying closer attention to it. So it's costly to mask, but sometimes it's worth paying that cost or appropriate to pay that cost. And the flip side is when you are unmasking with someone, sometimes people get the impression that like, oh, if I unmask, everyone will like it better. And that's not the point of unmasking. Like, trying to only do things that get positive responses from people is masking. The point of unmasking is that sometimes your authentic way of being, your authentic default response or whatever, might be something that someone else doesn't like and you do it anyway. Again, being judicious about the circumstances and the person, like not taking risks that feel overly large or whatever. But that's what we're talking about, is making someone happy with me and keeping this relationship going versus finding someone that they and I are a good fit to each other naturally. They're kind of two different ends of the spectrum, right? Like it's kind of like saying, how do I like be really careful but also not pay much attention to a thing or spend resources? Those are opposites, and they're useful in different ways. Right? When you start a new job and you have a boss and that's your boss, and if they don't like you, you don't have an opportunity to like keep trying and finding different bosses that likes you, then that's the time when it makes more sense to like care about what they want from you and give it to them. Not to say that you should do anything that they want, or like where dating, I think, is a very clear example to me of the time when it's most beneficial to like not go out of your way to try and make somebody else happy. You don't want to end up in a relationship with somebody where you don't know if they only will be happy continuing the relationship as long as you continue putting in that effort that you're putting in. Someday you get tired and it slips and the natural you comes out without the override and the care and whatever. And if they don't like that, well, it would have been a lot better to find that out on the first date than 2 years in. So same with the art, same with all this stuff. Like, yes, there are times when a client has a specific request with specific parameters and you're trying to bid against other people and make an offer where, you want to be really careful and put a lot of thought into giving them what they want. There are other times, like when you're just making something and putting it out there because you like it and want to put it out there, that it's more about finding your audience or letting your audience find you than it is about making the audience you have like you. All right, it's 2:02, so we'll wrap up. Any last thoughts?
Enjoyed the DM comments as well as the podcast comments, and thought it was interesting to get a glimpse into another person's process as a DM.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. All right. Good to be with you, Caitlin. Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with all of you.
And we'll be back next week, same time.
Bye, everybody.